I'm moving in with Mark. Emily's words hit me like a freight train. My wife, was standing in our living room, suitcase in hand, her lips twisted into that infuriatingly smug smile she wore when she knew she held all the cards. What the hell are you talking about? I demanded, my voice sharp, echoing off the walls. I told you already, Nathan. Mark and I need this. It's closure, she said, as if that was supposed to make sense. As if closure explained why she was abandoning our marriage to shack up with her ex-husband for 30 days. Closure. I spat the word like it burned. You're married to me. What kind of closure requires you living with him? Her phone buzzed on the counter, and I didn't need to check to know who it was. Mark. The name had been a constant shadow in our lives for weeks now. The late-night texts, the hush phone calls, the sudden work trips, it all clicked in that moment, and the rage boiling inside me nearly spilled over. Emily crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing as if I was the one in the wrong. You're overreacting, Nathan. This is about me figuring out what I want. What we want. It's only a month. Stop being so dramatic. A car horn blared outside, and my stomach sank. I glanced out the window and saw a sleek black SUV idling in the driveway. Of course, he was here, waiting for her like the snake he always was. And just like that, Emily picked up her suitcase, turned to me with a look that screamed, "You're pathetic," and said, "Don't wait up." The second she walked out that door, dragging her suitcase like a badge of her self-righteousness, I felt something crack deep inside me. It wasn't just anger, though there was plenty of that burning in my chest like wildfire. It was disbelief, betrayal, humiliation. My wife had just walked out of our home to stay with her ex-husband. And somehow, in her twisted version of reality, I was supposed to be okay with that. The SUV disappeared down the street, and I stood there frozen, staring at the empty driveway like an idiot. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. How long had this been going on? Was this really just about closure, or was it something worse? My gut told me the truth. I wasn't ready to admit. I needed answers. Emily's phone was still sitting on the counter, right where she left it buzzing a moment ago. I grabbed it, my hand trembling. I told myself I wasn't the kind of guy who invaded someone's privacy. But at that moment, I didn't care. Emily had crossed the line, and I needed to know how far she'd gone. Unlocking her phone was easy. She'd been careless enough to use the same passcode for everything. Our anniversary. My fingers moved fast, fueled by anger and desperation. I opened her messages first, scrolling through the names until I found his Mark. My stomach dropped when I saw the sheer number of messages. Hundreds, maybe thousands, all with that smug little contact photo of his smirking face. The latest text was timestamped just 5 minutes ago. I'm outside. Can't wait to see you. My throat tightened as I scrolled further back. The messages weren't just about closure. Far from it. They were filled with the kind of flirtation that made my skin crawl. Inside jokes, compliments, even pictures. One message, in particular, stood out sent just 2 nights ago. I miss the way we used to be. Can't wait to relive those nights with you. Relive those nights? My voice cracked as I whispered the words aloud, the meaning settling like a stone in my chest. My hand shook so badly I almost dropped the phone. This wasn't just emotional betrayal. It was physical too. There was no doubt in my mind now. Emily hadn't just been lying. She'd been playing me for a fool for God knows how long. But the worst was yet to come. I opened her photo gallery next. I shouldn't have, but I couldn't stop myself. It felt like staring into the abyss, knowing I wouldn't like what I found. Sure enough, there it was, pictures of Emily and Mark together. In restaurants, at the beach, even in what looked like a hotel room. Some of the photos were intimate. Too intimate for me to keep looking. I slammed the phone down on the counter, disgusted. My head spun. How had I not seen this before? How had she managed to hide something so blatant, so cruel? I replayed the last few months in my mind, searching for clues I might have missed. Her sudden disinterest in me. The late nights out. The way she always seemed distracted, her phone glued to her hand. It was all so obvious now, but I'd been too blind, or maybe too trusting, to see it. And then there was the most chilling thought of all. Had she ever really loved me? Or had I just been a placeholder while she figured out her feelings for Mark? The thought made my chest tighten, and I stumbled to the couch, dropping into it like the weight of the world had just crushed me. The room felt too quiet, too empty. The house we'd built together, filled with memories of laughter and love, now felt like a tomb. I stared at the pictures on the wall, wedding photos, vacations, family gatherings, and felt a surge of rage unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just anger at Emily. It was anger at myself for believing in a woman who could so easily betray me. I needed to confront her. Not tomorrow, not next week. Now. I wasn't going to let her walk away from this without facing what she'd done. But before I could move, another thought hit me like a slap to the face. What about Lily? My stepdaughter. Emily's daughter from her first marriage had always been a point of tension in our relationship. Lily, now 17, had never fully warmed up to me, and I had tried to give her space. But lately, she'd been colder than ever, siding with her mother on every argument and shutting me out completely. Did she know about this? Was she complicit in this betrayal? As if on cue, the front door creaked open, and Lily walked in. Her headphones were draped around her neck, and she barely glanced at me as she headed toward the stairs. "Lily," I called out, my voice harsher than I intended. She paused, turning back with an expression that was equal parts annoyed and defensive. "What?" she snapped. "Do you know where your mom went tonight?" She smirked, her eyes glinting with something I couldn't quite place. "Why? Didn't she tell you?" The way she said it, so casual, so dismissive, made my blood boil. "Don't play games with me, Lily. Did you know she's with Mark?" Her smirk widened, and she shrugged. "Of course I know. She's happier with him anyway. Maybe you should have done a better job keeping her happy." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. She knew. She knew, and she didn't care. If anything, she seemed to enjoy watching me squirm. My anger flared, but before I could say anything, she turned on her heel and disappeared upstairs, leaving me alone in the wreckage of my life. This wasn't just betrayal. This was war. I sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, staring at the walls of the home that now seemed like a stranger's house. The sound of Lily's door slamming upstairs echoed in my ears, amplifying the emptiness around me. My pulse thudded in my temples as my mind raced. I couldn't let this slide. Emily had to answer for what she'd done, for what she was doing. But how do you confront someone who's already left the battlefield? Emily was gone, and I had no idea where Mark lived. Well, not yet. My mind shifted to the resources I had. Her phone, still on the counter, practically begging to spill its secrets. I grabbed it, unlocking it again, and started searching through her apps. It didn't take long to find an Uber receipt for her ride earlier that night. Destination: 462 Maplewood Drive. Mark's place. My stomach churned as I stared at the address. This was it. This was where my wife, my partner, my supposed soulmate, was right now, likely wrapped up in her ex-husband's arms while I sat here like a fool. The anger inside me boiled over, and before I knew it, I was out the door, my keys in hand. The drive to Maplewood felt like an out-of-body experience. My knuckles were white as I gripped the steering wheel, replaying everything Emily had said, every lie she had told, over and over in my head. Closure? What a joke. This wasn't closure. This was betrayal, plain and simple. And Mark, that smug son of a no. I couldn't go there. Not yet. I needed to keep my head, even if every fiber of my being screamed at me to lose it. When I finally pulled up to 462 Maplewood, I parked down the street and killed the engine. The house was everything I imagined Mark's place would be. Modern, flashy, and oozing with the kind of arrogance only someone like him could pull off. The black SUV from earlier was parked in the driveway. The sight of it made my blood boil. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the house, debating what to do. Should I barge in? Should I knock on the door and demand answers? Or should I wait, play it cool, and catch them red-handed? My heart raced as I wrestled with the options, but before I could decide, the front door opened. There she was, Emily. She stepped out onto the porch, laughing at something Mark said from inside. She wasn't just laughing. She was glowing, her face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years. It was like watching a stranger. My wife. My wife. And then Mark appeared. He leaned casually against the doorframe, his arm brushing against hers. He said something I couldn't hear, and Emily swatted his arm playfully before stepping back inside. The door closed behind them, and I was left sitting there, seething. That was it. I couldn't just sit here and watch this unfold. I climbed out of the car, my fists clenched at my sides, and marched up to the house. My heart pounded in my chest as I rang the doorbell, the sound echoing through the quiet neighborhood. For a moment, there was nothing. Then footsteps. Then the door opened. Mark stood there, his face a mixture of surprise and smug satisfaction. "Nathan," he said, leaning casually against the doorframe. "What a surprise. Where is she?" My voice was low, trembling with barely contained rage. He smirked. "Emily's busy right now. Maybe you should have called first." I pushed past him before he could stop me, my eyes scanning the living room. And there she was, sitting on the couch with a glass of wine in hand, looking every bit as comfortable as if she belonged there. "Nathan," she said, her voice dripping with annoyance. "What are you doing here?" "What am I doing here?" I shot back, my voice rising. "What the hell are you doing here, Emily? You walk out of our house. Tell me you're moving in with your ex-husband for closure, and you expect me to just sit at home and wait for you." She rolled her eyes, setting her wine glass down on the coffee table. "You're being ridiculous. This isn't what you think." "Oh, really?" "Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like what I think." Mark stepped forward, his hands raised in mock surrender. "Hey man, maybe we should all just calm down." "Shut up," I snapped, turning back to Emily. "How long, Emily? How long has this been going on?" She sighed, crossing her arms over her chest. "You're making a scene." "I don't care if I'm making a scene," I shouted. "Answer me." Her eyes flicked to Mark for a split second, and that was all the confirmation I needed. "Unbelievable," I said, shaking my head. "You've been lying to me this whole time, haven't you?" Emily stood, her expression hardening. "You don't get to play the victim here, Nathan. Maybe if you'd been half the husband I needed, I wouldn't have to come here." Her words were like a slap to the face. I took a step back, the air knocked out of me. "So this is my fault now? You cheat on me, and it's my fault." She shrugged, her tone icy. "Maybe if you weren't so predictable, so boring. Maybe if you actually made me feel something once in a while, we wouldn't be here." I stared at her, stunned into silence. This wasn't the woman I'd married. This was someone else entirely, a stranger who'd taken her place. And as much as it hurt, I knew there was no coming back from this. The silence that followed her words was deafening, as if the world itself had paused to let her venom sink in. I stood there, staring at Emily, trying to process what she'd just said. Predictable? Boring? My voice was low, trembling with anger and disbelief. "Is that all I ever was to you?" Emily didn't flinch. If anything, she seemed emboldened by my reaction, her eyes narrowing in defiance. "I'm just being honest, Nathan. Maybe that's something you've never been willing to hear." "Honest?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You call this honesty? Sneaking around with Mark behind my back, lying to my face, and then blaming me for it? That's not honesty, Emily. That's cowardice." Mark cleared his throat, stepping forward as if to insert himself into the conversation. "Nathan, I think it's time you leave. Emily and I." "Don't you dare say another word," I snapped, turning to face him. My fists clenched at my sides, and it took everything in me not to cross that line, not to let the rage consume me completely. This is between me and my wife. Or does she even count as that anymore? Mark raised his hands in mock surrender, a smirk playing on his lips. "Look, I get that you're upset. You don't get anything," I interrupted, my voice cutting through the room like a knife. "You think this is some game, don't you? Stealing another man's wife, ruining a marriage. What's next, Mark? Gonna teach me how to be less boring too?" Emily sighed, rubbing her temples as if she were the victim here. "Nathan, stop. You're making a fool of yourself." "No, Emily," I shot back. "The only fool here is the one who spent 8 years building a life with someone who clearly never deserved it." Her face hardened, but before she could respond, the sound of footsteps on the stairs broke the tension. I turned to see Lily standing there, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "What's going on?" she asked, though there was no real curiosity in her tone. It was more of a challenge, a test to see if I dare drag her into this mess. "This doesn't concern you," I said, my voice firm but not unkind. "Oh, it does," Lily replied, descending the stairs with deliberate slowness. "It concerns me because I'm tired of hearing you two argue. Honestly, Nathan, maybe Mom's right. Maybe you're just not enough for her." The words hit me harder than Emily's ever could. I stared at Lily, trying to understand how someone I'd tried so hard to connect with, to support, could side with her mother so easily. "You knew about this, didn't you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "You knew she was seeing Mark." Lily shrugged, her casual indifference like a slap to the face. "So what if I did? Mom deserves to be happy. And let's face it, you're not exactly Mr. Exciting." "Lily," Emily warned, but her tone lacked conviction. It was clear she wasn't upset with her daughter for speaking out. If anything, she seemed to agree. I turned back to Emily, my voice trembling with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. "Is this what you've been teaching her? That loyalty doesn't matter? That promises mean nothing?" Emily rolled her eyes. "Oh, spare me the righteous speech, Nathan. You act like you're some perfect husband, but the truth is, you've been coasting for years. You stopped trying a long time ago." "Stop trying?" I repeated, my voice breaking. "Emily, I've done nothing but try. I've supported you, loved you, forgiven you more times than I can count. And this," I gestured around the room, at her, at Mark, at Lily's smug face. "This is how you repay me?" For a moment, there was silence. Emily looked away, refusing to meet my eyes. Mark shifted uncomfortably, and even Lily seemed unsure of what to say. The weight of the truth hung heavy in the air, undeniable and inescapable. Finally, Emily spoke, her voice quieter but no less cutting. "Maybe you're right, Nathan. Maybe I don't deserve you. But maybe you don't deserve me either." The words were like a dagger to the heart. I stared at her, the woman I'd once thought I'd spend the rest of my life with, and realized there was nothing left to save. The person standing in front of me wasn't the Emily I'd fallen in love with. She was someone else entirely, someone I didn't recognize, someone I couldn't trust. I took a deep breath, the anger and pain swirling inside me threatening to consume me. But I couldn't let it. "Not here, not now. You're right about one thing, Emily," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging within me. "I don't deserve this. I don't deserve you." With that, I turned and walked out the door. I didn't look back. I couldn't. If I did, I wasn't sure I'd be able to keep going. The weight of betrayal, of heartbreak, was almost too much to bear. But I knew one thing for certain. I was done fighting for someone who didn't want to be fought for. The cold night air hit me as I stepped outside, and for the first time in what felt like hours, I took a deep breath. It was over. Whatever this was, whatever we'd had, it was over. As I got into my car and drove away, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Anger, sadness, relief. But most of all, I felt a sense of clarity. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing. I deserved better. And for the first time in a long time, I was ready to fight for myself. The drive home was eerily silent, the hum of the engine doing little to drown out the storm in my head. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white, but I couldn't relax. Every mile brought me closer to the house I had once called a home, now just a cruel reminder of everything that had fallen apart. The betrayal wasn't just Emily's. It was Lily's too. Her indifference, her smugness, her outright support for her mother's actions burned in my mind like a brand. I had tried so hard to connect with her, to be the stepfather she deserved, even when she pushed me away at every turn. And now, she'd chosen sides, and it wasn't mine. When I pulled into the driveway, I sat in the car for a moment, staring at the dark windows of the house. It felt foreign now, like I didn't belong there anymore. But I knew I had to go inside. I couldn't let Emily's actions, her lies, define me. Not here, not in the place I had built with my own hands. The door creaked as I stepped inside, and the silence hit me like a wall. No laughter, no voices, no signs of life. Just the echoes of memories that now felt hollow. I dropped my keys on the counter and stood there for a moment, trying to decide what to do next. My eyes landed on a picture frame sitting on the mantel. It was a photo of Emily and me on our honeymoon, standing on a beach with the sun setting behind us. We looked so happy, so in love. I picked up the frame, staring at it as if it could give me answers. But all it did was remind me of how far we had fallen. With a surge of anger, I slammed the frame down on the counter, the glass shattering into 1,000 tiny pieces. The sound echoed through the empty house, and for a moment I just stood there, breathing heavily, staring at the shards. It felt symbolic in a way. Our life together, shattered beyond repair. I couldn't stay here. Not tonight. The walls felt like they were closing in, suffocating me with memories I didn't want to face. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the one name I needed, Jake. Jake had been my best friend since college. He was the kind of guy who always had your back, no matter what. If anyone could help me make sense of this mess, it was him. The phone rang twice before he picked up. "Nathan? What's up, man? It's late. I need to talk," I said, my voice trembling despite my efforts to keep it steady. "Can I come over?" There was a pause on the other end. Then Jake's voice softened. "Of course. Come on by." The drive to Jake's place felt like a blur. By the time I pulled into his driveway, the anger and sadness were bubbling dangerously close to the surface. Jake must have seen it in my face the moment he opened the door, because he didn't say a word. He just stepped aside and let me in. I collapsed onto his couch, my head in my hands, trying to hold myself together. Jake sat across from me, waiting patiently. He knew better than to push me to talk before I was ready. Finally, I looked up, meeting his concerned gaze. "She's with Mark?" I said, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. Jake's eyebrows shot up. "Mark? You mean?" "Yeah," I interrupted, cutting him off. "Her ex-husband. She moved in with him tonight. For closure," she said. I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and hollow. "Closure. What a joke." Jake leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening. "And you just let her go? What was I supposed to do?" I shot back, the frustration spilling out. "Drag her out of his house? Beg her to stay? She's made her choice, Jake. And it's not me." He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. "So what now?" "I don't know," I admitted, my voice cracking. "I don't know what to do, Jake. I feel like my whole life just blew up in my face." Jake leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Look, man, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. What Emily did, that's unforgivable. She didn't just betray you. She disrespected you. And if you let her walk all over you now, she'll keep doing it." "I know," I said, my fists clenching at my sides. "But it's not just her. It's Lily, too. She knew, Jake. She knew, and she didn't care. She even defended Emily, said I wasn't enough for her." Jake's expression darkened. "That's rough. But Nathan, you can't let their actions define you. You got to take control of this situation. If Emily wants to play games, let her. But don't sit around waiting for her to come back. You deserve better than that." His words hit me hard, but they were exactly what I needed to hear. I nodded slowly, the fog in my mind starting to lift. "You're right," I said. "I can't keep living like this. I need to move on." Jake clapped me on the shoulder, a small smile tugging at his lips. "That's the spirit. And don't worry, you've got me in your corner. Whatever you need, I'm here." For the first time all night, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was the beginning of something new, something better. Emily might have shattered the life we'd built together, but she hadn't broken me. Not completely. And as I sat there with Jake, planning my next steps, I realized one thing. I was done being the victim. It was time to take my life back. The next morning, sunlight filtered through Jake's living room blinds, piercing my eyes like needles. I groaned, rubbing my temples. I hadn't slept much, and the little rest I did get was haunted by dreams of Emily and Mark. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw her laughing with him, her hand brushing his, their shared looks of familiarity. It was like a cruel loop I couldn't escape. Jake's voice broke through the haze. "Coffee?" I nodded, sitting up on the couch. He handed me a steaming mug, and I sipped it slowly, letting the bitterness jolt me awake. Jake sat down across from me, leaning forward with that same no-nonsense look he always wore when he had something important to say. "So, what's the plan?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "The plan?" I echoed, feeling the weight of the question settle on my chest. "I don't know, Jake. What am I supposed to do? She's already gone. What's left to fight for?" Jake raised an eyebrow. "Fight? Nathan, this isn't about fighting for her. This is about fighting for you. Emily made her choice, and from what you've told me, it's clear she's not coming back. So now it's up to you to decide how you move forward." I stared into my coffee, the steam curling upward like smoke from the wreckage of my life. He was right, of course. There was no salvaging this marriage, no fixing what Emily had broken. But that didn't make the decision any easier. "Divorce," I said finally, the word feeling foreign on my tongue. "I guess that's the only option." Jake nodded. "It's the cleanest option. Cut your losses, move on. But you got to do it smart. No more sitting around feeling sorry for yourself." "I know," I said, though the thought of ending my marriage, of untangling 8 years of shared memories, finances, and everything else, felt like staring into a bottomless pit. Jake leaned back, crossing his arms. "First things first, get a lawyer. A good one. Someone who'll make sure you don't get screwed over." I nodded, making a mental note to start searching for one as soon as I got home. "And what about the house? The finances? Everything we've built together?" Jake's expression softened slightly. "That's what the lawyer's for, man. But listen, don't let her guilt you into giving her more than she deserves. She chose to leave. She chose Mark. She doesn't get to have her cake and eat it too." His words were like a lifeline, pulling me out of the whirlpool of doubt and indecision. I wasn't powerless. I still had choices, still had control over my future. And as painful as it was to admit, my future no longer included Emily. By the time I left Jake's place, I felt more grounded than I had in days. The drive home was different this time. I wasn't replaying the past in my head, wasn't drowning in the what-ifs and whys. Instead, I was focused on the next steps. When I walked into the house, it felt less suffocating than it had the night before. The broken picture frame was still on the counter, shards of glass glinting in the sunlight. I grabbed a broom and started sweeping up the mess, the rhythmic motion oddly therapeutic. As I tossed the broken pieces into the trash, it felt like a small victory, a symbolic first step toward cleaning up the mess Emily had left behind. I spent the rest of the day making calls. First to a lawyer recommended by Jake, then to a locksmith. I wasn't about to let Emily waltz back in whenever she felt like it. By the time the locksmith arrived, I had already packed up most of her belongings, stuffing them into boxes and leaving them by the front door. The locksmith worked quickly, and within an hour, the locks were changed. I thanked him, paid him, and closed the door behind him with a sense of finality. Emily no longer had a place here. This was my home now, mine and mine alone. Later that evening, as I sat on the couch with a beer in hand, I heard a car pull into the driveway. My heart rate spiked, but I forced myself to stay calm. Moments later, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Emily standing there, her face a mix of confusion and anger. "What the hell is this?" she demanded, gesturing to the boxes on the porch. "It's your stuff," I said, my voice steady. "You don't live here anymore." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "You can't be serious." "Oh, I'm serious," I said, crossing my arms. "You made your choice, Emily. You chose Mark. So now you get to live with the consequences." She opened her mouth to argue, but I cut her off. "The locks are changed. The papers are being drafted. This marriage is over." For a moment, she just stared at me, as if she couldn't believe I was actually standing up to her. Then her expression shifted, a smirk curling at the corners of her lips. "You think you're so righteous, don't you, Nathan? You think you're the victim here." "I don't think it, Emily. I know it, but I'm done playing that role. I'm moving on, and so are you." Her smirk faltered, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. But she quickly masked it, turning her attention to the boxes. "Fine," she said, her tone icy. "But don't think for a second that this is over." She grabbed one of the boxes and stormed back to her car, her heels clicking against the pavement. I watched as she drove off, a strange sense of relief washing over me. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. This wasn't the end. There was still a long road ahead, lawyers, paperwork, and the inevitable fallout. But as I stood there in the quiet of the evening, I realized something important. I was free. Free from her lies, her manipulation, her betrayal. And that freedom was worth everything. The house was eerily quiet after Emily left, but for the first time in what felt like forever, it wasn't suffocating. It was peaceful. The air felt lighter without the constant weight of her presence, her lies, her smug disdain. I stood in the middle of the living room, looking at the boxes she'd left behind, and realized I wasn't sad. I wasn't angry anymore either. Not in the same way. What I felt was resolve. This was my life now, and it was time to take it back. The first thing I did was get rid of anything that reminded me of her. Wedding photos? Gone. The fancy dinnerware she insisted we buy, but never used? Packed up and ready for donation. Even the throw pillows she loved, but I always thought were hideous, went into the pile. It felt cathartic, like shedding old skin. By the time I was done, the house looked bare, but it also felt like a blank canvas. A fresh start. I ordered a pizza, cracked open another beer, and sat on the couch, scrolling through furniture websites on my phone. If I was going to rebuild my life, I was going to do it my way, starting with a new couch. One that didn't have memories of Emily sprawled across it, texting Mark while I thought we were watching a movie together. As the days passed, I settled into a new routine. Work was a welcome distraction, and Jake checked in on me regularly, making sure I wasn't drowning in my thoughts. I wasn't. If anything, I was thriving in a way I hadn't expected. Each small step, whether it was cooking dinner for myself, rearranging furniture, or going for a run, felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that I'd lost during my marriage. But the biggest test came when I ran into Lily. It happened at the grocery store, of all places. I was standing in the cereal aisle, debating between two brands, when I heard her voice behind me. Still buying the same boring cereal. Huh? I turned to see her standing there, a grocery basket in hand, her expression guarded but curious. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. The last time we'd spoken, she'd sided with Emily, throwing my efforts as a stepfather back in my face. But now she looked different, almost hesitant. "Lily," I said, nodding in acknowledgement. "Surprised to see you here." She shrugged, glancing at the shelves. "Mom sent me to pick up a few things." Of course. Emily was still pulling the strings. I bit back the urge to ask how Mark was treating them and instead focused on the moment. "How are you doing?" She hesitated, then shrugged again. "Fine, I guess." It wasn't much, but it was something. I decided to push a little. "Look, Lily, I know things have been tense between us, and I know you probably think I wasn't the best stepdad. But for what it's worth, I tried. I really did." Her eyes flicked up to meet mine, and for a moment, I saw a flash of guilt. "I know you did," she said quietly, "and I didn't make it easy." The admission caught me off guard. "No, you didn't," I said with a small, wry smile. "But that's part of being a teenager, right?" She laughed lightly, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like we were on the same page. "I guess so," she said, her voice softer. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry for some of the stuff I said. It wasn't fair." "Apology accepted," I said, meaning it. "And for what it's worth, I don't blame you for taking your mom's side. She's your mom. But just so you know, I never stopped caring about you. Even now." She nodded, her eyes misting over just a little before she blinked it away. "Thanks," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We stood there for a moment, the awkwardness melting away, replaced by something that felt a lot like understanding. She excused herself after a few minutes, but not before saying, "Take care of yourself, Nathan." It was a small gesture, but it meant the world to me. That encounter stayed with me as I continued to rebuild. It reminded me that not everything about my life with Emily had been bad. Lily had been a part of it, and despite everything, I still cared about her. But I also knew that my focus had to stay on myself. For the first time in years, I was my own priority. I started going to the gym again, something I hadn't done since the early years of my marriage. At first, it was just to blow off steam, but it quickly became a source of clarity and strength. Each mile on the treadmill, each weight lifted, felt like a victory, a reminder that I was capable of more than I'd given myself credit for. I also started reconnecting with old friends, people I'd drifted away from during my marriage. They welcomed me back with open arms, and I realized how much I'd missed those connections. One night, over beers with Jake and a few college buddies, I found myself laughing harder than I had in years. It felt good. It felt right. But perhaps the biggest change was in how I saw myself. For so long, I defined myself as Emily's husband, as Lily's stepfather. But now I was just Nathan. And while that scared me at first, it also excited me. I had a chance to rediscover who I was, to rebuild my life on my own terms. By the time the divorce papers were finalized, I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't expected. Not because of the paperwork, but because I'd done the work to move on. Emily was no longer the center of my world, and her betrayal no longer defined me. Standing in my newly furnished living room, looking out at the world through fresh eyes, I realized something important. I wasn't broken. I wasn't defeated. I was free. It's strange how life has a way of moving forward, even when you feel like your world has ended. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, and before I knew it, the wounds Emily left behind began to scab over. They weren't healed completely. Not yet, but they didn't sting the way they used to. Time didn't erase the pain, but it dulled it, made it manageable. And in the meantime, I discovered something I hadn't expected: peace. One morning, I found myself sitting at the dining table, sipping coffee and scrolling through emails. The sunlight streamed through the windows, warming the room. I'd gotten used to the quiet by now, but today it didn't feel lonely. It felt serene, a clean slate. My mind was clearer than it had been in years. The divorce had been finalized a few weeks earlier. Emily and I barely spoke through the process. The lawyers handled most of it, and in the end, we divided everything cleanly. I kept the house, the car, and my dignity. She got what she wanted too: freedom to pursue her closure with Mark, though I doubted their fantasy would last long. But that wasn't my problem anymore. I was done being weighed down by her choices. What surprised me most was how quickly I began to feel like myself again. It wasn't an overnight transformation. It was slow, subtle. Little things like waking up without dread sitting heavy in my chest, laughing at something without feeling guilty, finding joy in small moments, like reading a book or taking a long walk. And then there was the night I met someone new. Jake had been pestering me for weeks to join him at a local bar trivia night. "You need to get out," he kept saying. "You've been cooped up in that house for too long." I resisted at first, but eventually I caved. I wasn't expecting much, just a few drinks, some laughs, and maybe a chance to forget about everything for a while. What I didn't expect was her. Her name was Rachel. She was sitting at the bar with a group of friends, her laughter cutting through the noise like a melody. She had dark hair that spilled over her shoulders, and her eyes sparkled with a warmth that made her feel approachable. I wasn't looking for anything. Honestly, I wasn't even sure I was ready, but something about her caught my attention. Jake noticed too. "You should go talk to her," he said, nudging me with his elbow. "No way," I replied, shaking my head. "It's too soon." Jake rolled his eyes. "It's been months, Nathan. You're not proposing. Just say hi. Worst case, she's not interested. Best case, you make a new friend." I hesitated, but Jake wasn't wrong. I'd spent so much time focusing on rebuilding myself that I hadn't even considered the possibility of letting someone else in. Maybe it was time to take that first step. Gathering my courage, I walked over to her table, my palms sweaty and my heart pounding. "Hi," I said, offering a nervous smile. "I'm Nathan. Mind if I join you?" She looked up, surprised at first, but then she smiled, a genuine, open smile that immediately put me at ease. "Sure," she said, gesturing to the empty chair. "I'm Bicha." We talked for hours that night, long after her friends had left. She told me about her work as a graphic designer, her love of hiking and photography, and her terrible luck with trivia questions. I told her about my job, my recent foray into furniture shopping, and, hesitantly, about my divorce. I expected her to recoil, but she didn't. She listened, nodding with understanding, and even shared her own story of heartbreak, a long-term relationship that had ended in betrayal. "I guess we both know what it's like to start over," she said, her eyes meeting mine. Yeah, I replied, feeling a strange sense of connection. Starting over is hard, but maybe it's not so bad. We exchanged numbers that night, and while I wasn't sure where it would lead, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Over the next few weeks, Rachel and I grew closer. She wasn't just a distraction or a rebound. She was kind, funny, and genuine in a way that felt refreshing. We took things slow, meeting for coffee, going for walks, and talking about everything and nothing. She made me laugh, made me think, and, most importantly, made me feel like myself again. But it wasn't just Rachel who helped me move forward. I continued to focus on my own growth, setting goals and challenging myself in ways I hadn't before. I started running every morning, pushing myself further each time. I signed up for a cooking class, learning to make dishes I never would have attempted before. And I spent more time with friends, reconnecting with the people who had always been there for me, even when I'd been too blind to see it. One evening, as I stood in my backyard watching the sunset, I realized something profound. Losing Emily had felt like the end of the world, but in reality, it was the beginning of a new chapter. A better chapter. One where I wasn't defined by someone else's choices or limited by their expectations. I was free to be Nathan. Just Nathan. And that was enough. Looking back, I wouldn't wish the pain of betrayal on anyone. It was devastating, soul-crushing. But in the end, it forced me to grow in ways I never would have otherwise. It taught me resilience, self-worth, and the importance of surrounding myself with people who genuinely cared. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared over the horizon, I smiled to myself, feeling a peace I hadn't known in years. This wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning.